So, page 88. We now continue chapter number 4 in the Tanya, based on the Steinsaltz Tanya. V'hinei b'chinas ha-tzimzum v'hester ha-chayis nikra b'shem kelim. The concept of constriction and concealment of the life force is referred to by the term vessels. Whereas the life force itself is referred to by the term light. Just as a vessel hides its contents. So on one hand, it's a vessel. It's an independent object. On the other hand, if light goes through it, it hides the contents. If you're having Cheerios in a bowl of cereal, so the bowl hides the contents of the cereal. Similarly, if you put light through a colored glass, the glass now becomes the vessel. The light changes colors. But at the same time, it's a filter to the light. So the light represents the life, and the vessels represent the concealment. So just as the vessel hides its content, so too the constriction covers and conceals flow of the light and life force. In the Hebrew, so this concept of light and vessels in the Chassidus is called the concept of Tzimzum, a very famous concept in Kabbalah, all over Kabbalah. This is the secret of creation. In Lurianic Kabbalah, there's great discussion on how the Tzimzum took place. We're going to talk about it later here in Shaykh V'Amunah. But now the Alter Rebbe introduces it in simple terms by saying that the secret of the Tzimzum, you should know, is light and vessels. He goes on to explain, Vakelim, on page 89, Vakelim, hein, ha'isius. What are these vessels? These vessels are the very letters comprising the 10 utterances of creation. Shesharshon hei ha'isius mansapach, shehein hei gevurais. What are these letters? There are 22 letters in the Torah. And these 22 letters God used to create the entire world. And now he goes on to say that in addition to what we said in chapter 1, that God recreates the world every moment anew through these 10 utterances of creation. And that these 10 utterances of creation come about through the 22 letters of creation. And every object of the millions and millions of different objects in the world all have a name in Hebrew that creates it, like an Even, a stone is Aleph Beis Nun, a dog is Chaf Lamed Beis. Every animal, every creation, every flower has Hebrew letters that continue to vivify it every moment, ex nihilo, from nothing into something. And it's through the permutation of the letters that new objects and new creations and new scientific breakthroughs continue to emerge. Yet, he adds now that these 22 letters have a source. Shesharshon hei oisius mansapach shehein hei gevurais. In essence, he says that these 22 letters have an origin that are 5 letters. And these 5 letters, as an acronym, are called mansapach, which are Mim, Nun, Tzadik, Pei, and Chaf, which all have a different form when they appear at the end of the word. And these are the 5 aspects of Gevura, restraining forces. That separate and differentiate the breath and the voice through the 5 organs of articulation in order to bring forth the 22 letters. So what is the Alter Rebbe saying here? The Alter Rebbe is saying here that the 22 letters of the Hebrew Aleph base, the Aleph base, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Ches, Tes, etc., are actually divided into 5 groups, 5 organs of articulation. There are letters that are formed from the lips. There are letters that are formed from the tongue. There are letters that are formed from the cheek. Other letters come from the throat. And by having these 5 organs of articulation, the 22 letters are divided even more. In other words, we just established that the vessels are the letters, and therefore the letters are the gevura, are the judgment and the severity that holds back this infinite light to make the light finite, to allow us to exist as independent creatures. He now goes on to say that in addition to the 22 letters that create 22 limits and 22 stop signs on God's infinite light, in addition to that, you should know that all these 22 letters have an additional gevura, an additional framework of withholding the light by the fact that they come from the 5 powers of gevura, the 5 levels of judgment. And these 5 letters of judgment break the 22 letters into 5 different parts. And they are divided by these 5 different letters, which come from 5 different organs of articulation. There's another detail over here, and that is these 5 letters, the mem, the nun, the samach, the pei, and the chaf, are actually double letters. As we know that there are some letters that are only used at the end of a word. And these letters, the mem, is used at the middle of the word, and then there's the final mem at the end of the word. You have the nun in the middle of the word, the final nun at the end of the word, the tzaddik in the middle of the word, the end tzaddik at the end of the word, the pei and the final pei, the chaf and the final chaf. If you have the Aleph-based chart, right, in your siddur or in the book Letters of Light, you can see over here, there's the mem, right, and then the final mem. There's the nun, right, and the final nun. There's the pei, right, and the final pei. The tzaddik and the final tzaddik. So the fact that there's a final mem, the fact that there's a final nun, the fact that there's the final tzaddik, a final pei, and a final chaf, this means that there's an additional level of gevura, an additional level of restraint, because the final letter ends the word. You cannot continue talking to the stop sign. There's a period, exclamation point, question mark, whatever it is, but it stops the word, it stops the sentence. And therefore it creates an additional gevura. So now he's saying that when it comes to tzimzum, when it comes to the contraction and the concealment of light, how is it done? For the 22 letters. And in the 22 letters, you have 5 organs of articulation, which make it even more gevuradik. It makes it even more concealed. Now it's interesting. There's a famous teaching of the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. And he says in chapter 48 the following. The Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer of Hyrcanus, who was the teacher of Rabbi Akiva, he writes that there are 5 letters that are doubled, as we just explained, mansapach. But he says these 5 letters represent geula, represent redemption. And we'll soon talk about it. But just to preface it by saying that in general, the number 22, the 22 letters, how do you remember that 22 letters? It's based on a verse, B'cha Yivarech Yisrael. B'cha, in you, Beis Chaf, the Jewish people will be blessed. So what are the 22 letters for? What's the purpose of these 22 letters? Not to, God forbid, speak ill of others or to be condescending, but rather with these 22 letters, you will bless your neighbor. You will bring light to the world. Furthermore, now that we have the 5 additional N letters, so it's not only 22 letters, but we have now 27 letters. What does 27 stand for? Shemin Zayizach, pure olive oil. It's pure. These 27 letters bring purity into the world. Now let's focus on the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer and listen very intently to what he says. Rabbi Eliezer says 5 letters are double in the Torah, and all of them have within them the secret of Geula, the secret of redemption. The letter Chaf, he says, Boy Nigal Avram, Avram Avinu was saved from the firing inferno from the letter Chaf. Why? As it says in the Torah, Lech lecha mi'atzrecha. God tells Avram, leave your land. I want to take you from a state of exile to a state of Geula. So lecha, lech lecha, there are 2 chafs over here. So we see a double chaf represents Geula. Mem, the letter Mem is also double. It also represents Geula, as we find by Yitzchak. God says in the Torah, Lech mimanu ki etzamta mimenu miyoid. So here, through the king Abimelech, he says to Yitzchak, go from us, because you have become too powerful. Again, leave us, go somewhere else. But here we find a double mem, mi'imanu. The double mem represents a state of redemption. Yitzchak now was on his own. He became independent. He was able to do what he wanted. Then we have the nun. Through the letter nun, Yaakov Avinu was saved from his brother Esau. As it says, Hatzileini no miyad ochi miyad Esau. Jacob prays to God, save me, please. Again, a double nun. Hatzileini no, from my brother Esau. The letter Pei, this is the way our forefathers were redeemed from Egypt. And it says, Pokoid pokadeti eschem. I will remember and surely remember you and take you out of Egypt. And these are the words that Moshe Rabbeinu said when he came to redeem the Jewish people. So Yaakov Avinu, before he dies, he said, you should know God will not forsake you and he will surely remember you. And these 2 words were the secret words that Moshe Rabbeinu had to give over to prove that he was the true savior of Israel. He said, Pokoit pekadeti. Redeem shall I redeem, and I will not forget. I have remembered you. So the question is, if Moshe Rabbeinu knew it, maybe other people knew it too. So why is this a proof that Moshe Rabbeinu was the true savior of Israel? Now it's true when he came and he said, Pokoit pekadeti, remember shall I remember. The God says he has remembered you when you're suffering and your pain. He wants to take you out of Egypt. So how is it that this proves that Moshe Rabbeinu was the Redeemer? And as the Medrash goes on to say, they went to Serach bas Asher, the daughter of Asher, who had long years and lived up until this time. And they said to her, a man came. He says he's the Redeemer. And so she asked, what did he say to you? He used a double terminology of the pay, Pokoit pekadeti. Aha. Yes, he's the real one. He's the real deal. But anyone could have stolen this password. Anyone could have stolen these 2 words, and they would say they are the Redeemer. So one of the commentaries explained that Moshe Rabbeinu at that time had a lisp. We know until the giving of the Torah, he had a lisp. And that was one of the excuses why he told God, don't send me to Pharaoh. I can't speak properly. I have a lisp. And God said, look, I gave man his mouth. You go, you talk to Pharaoh. But one of the proofs that Moshe Rabbeinu was the Redeemer is because he couldn't pronounce the letter Pei. He had a lisp. And the fact that he was able to say it clearly, Pokoid pekadeti, this proved to the B'nai Yisrael, the Jewish people, that he was truly the Redeemer of Israel. Now, after God gave the Torah on Sinai, as I mentioned a few moments ago, everybody was healed from their ailments. Those who were blind were able to see. Those who were deaf were able to hear. And Similarly, those that had lisps and could not articulate properly were able to speak. So Moshe Rabbeinu was now able to speak. And so it will be very soon when Mashiach comes. All of us will be healed from all of our imperfections. And finally, says the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, that so too is with the letter Tzadik. The letter Tzadik is a double letter. This is the password. This is the secret code that Mashiach is going to use when he comes to redeem us. He's going to say, Tzemach Tzemachti. And he's going to be called Tzemach. And from him, Yismach will sprout forth the Redeemer and the Scion of Israel. And this was given over to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, etc., from the beginning of time. So here we see that on one hand, says the Alter Rebbe, that these 5 letters of Mansapach represent Gevura. And here we say in the Medrash that these 5 letters represent Geula. But we understand that they're really mutually symbiotic. They are mutually symbiotic because through Golus, through Gevura, through concealment, it brings out a deeper sense of connection. And it creates a deeper sense of emotion. It creates a deeper sense of desire to connect because there's a deep concealment. And you feel distant from God, you work harder now to want to return and get closer. So on one hand, says Alter Rebbe here, Mansapach are the 5 levels of Gevura. Yet the Medrash says these are the 5 letters of redemption. And again, they are mutually symbiotic. And furthermore, as we'll soon see, Gevura and Chesed come from the same place. Gevura, which is severity and judgment, come from the same place as Chesed and kindness. And furthermore, there is the concept, according to Kabbalah and Chassidus, when Chesed and Gevura meet and unite, it makes the Chesed Gevura. What does that mean? Chesed, kindness, represents rain and one who is the benefactor, one who gives. Gevura generally represents one that holds back, conceals, restrains. However, when Gevura and Chesed unite, what happens is the Chesed, the kindness, becomes much more forceful. It becomes much more powerful. It's like a rain. There could be a little drizzle, a light drizzle, and then you can have a harder rain. But then there's a mabul, there's a flood. It's raining so powerful. This is the idea that from the Gevura, from the severity, from the concealment of exile, we're going to have the greatest blessings and the greatest kindness that will come about through these 5 letters of Geula, these 5 letters of redemption. And therefore, these letters, these 5 different organs of articulation divide the 22 letters of the alphabet. It continues here on page 90. And the root of these 5 aspects of Gevura, who boitzina the kar doinisa, represents the candle of darkness, which is the supernal Gevura of Atag, which is literally means ancient days. So Atag, which is in the level of God's crown, which is higher than the 3 levels of intellect, higher than the 7 levels of emotions. And therefore, it comes from a very high place, which is beyond creation. And there, in its root, in its source, Chesed and Gevura are truly one. And the root of the aspect of Chesed is also Chesed of Atag, as known to those initiated in the esoteric wisdom of Kabbalah. This ends chapter 4. But really, chapter 4, the end of chapter 4, is connected to chapter 5. So therefore, let us learn now chapter 5. And then we will try to elaborate and connect these 2 ideas together. There's a lot to talk about here in the end of chapter 4 and chapter 5. So we'll touch upon it a little bit today, and God willing, to elaborate it in the class to come, chapter 5. With regard to this, the rabbis have stated, at the beginning, God, when he created the world, he wanted to create the world with judgment. However, he saw that the world would not be able to last. What did he do? He combined it and he brought into the world the attribute of mercy. He combined it with the attribute of mercy. What does it mean? That he added the attribute of mercy, says the Alter Rebbe. This is the attribute through revelation of godliness, through the miracles of tzaddikim, and the miracles that we find recorded in the Torah. So let's look at this for a moment. If you open up a Chumash, you will see the beginning of the story of creation. It says, Bereshis bara alikim, right? You all are familiar with these three opening words. In the beginning, God created. Now it says over here, Bereshis bara alikim. Who created the world? Elokim. Elokim, as we just explained in the previous classes here in Shayich V'Emunah, represents the attribute of Gevura, the attribute of severity of judgment, and the concept of Tzimzum, concealment. So really what happened over here, when God created the world, he first wanted to create the world only with judgment. In other words, you're either in or you're out. One mistake, you're dead. You violate one commandment, you're finished. He saw that the world would not be able to sustain itself, that people are human, people make mistakes. What did he do? He adds now the attribute of mercy. Where do we see this? We see this in the Torah as well. In chapter number 2, verse number 4, it says, Eile seildes hashemayim va'aretz. These are the chronicles of heaven and earth. Bihibaram, when God created it. Biyoim, on the day, Asois Hashem Elikim Eretz v'Shamayim. On the day that God creates heaven and earth. But here, in verse number 4, the Torah says Hashem Elikim, or Havaya Elikim. In verse number 4, he not only says God created the world through Elikim, which is the attribute of Gevura, the attribute of judgment, but here now it says he adds Havaya. He adds the attribute of God, which is the attribute of kindness and the attribute of mercy. And this is the meaning here in the Medrash of Bereshis Rabbah that was written by the authors of the Talmud and the authors of the Mishnah. He says over here that what does it mean? That God wanted to create the world with the attribute of Gevura, but he was able to administer also later the attribute of kindness and mercy. That means that he brought into the world miracles. Miracles is God's kindness to the world. Miracles is God's mercy to the world. Not only miracles that took place in the 5 books of Moses, the splitting of the Red Sea, and the revelation of God in Sinai, and of course the 10 plagues, which the ethics of our fathers tell us wasn't only plagues, it was plagues to the Egyptians, but it was miracles to us because he saved us from these 10 plagues. This is all a sign of God's mercy into the world. And God added this mercy before he created the world. When he planned the blueprint of creation, he said, look, let's start with judgment. No, I can't do judgment because people make mistakes. I can't just kill them for one mistake. So I'm going to add kindness and mercy into the world. How? Well, I'll sprinkle a few miracles here and there. Once in a while, I'll get the Red Sea to split. Another few miracles, I'll get the Jordan to stop flowing. I'll get the walls of Jericho to fall down, and then I'll continue it through the prophets, through the holy tzaddikim, through the great mystics, through the Baal Shem Tov, and the Magi, and Alter Rebbe, and other Hasidic leaders who were able to perform great, great miracles. This is God's mercy to the world. We'll soon tell a story which shows, again, these mercies that God performs to the world. Let's just finish here a few more lines. Page 97. It says in the Zayar that above, on the side of supernal holiness, is Yemina, is Shemala. There's a right side and there's a left side. What does that mean? God is not an image. He's not a physical body. God is beyond all configurations, all names. So what does it mean God has a right side, left side? But when the Zohar says that in the supernal world, there's a right side and a left side, it means that there is the quality of kindness. Chesed, which is from the right hand, the right side. Gevura, which is severity and judgment, from the left side. Perush, this means that both of these sefirot are divine attributes beyond the comprehension of created beings. It's beyond our understanding. Even God's kindness is beyond our understanding. And similarly, God's gevura beyond He and His attributes are truly one in the world of Atzilus. In other words, as we explained earlier, just like it's impossible to understand how God, on one hand, creates the world every moment anew, and yet we feel totally independent. It's beyond our comprehension. Similarly, it's impossible to understand how God is able to create the world every moment ex nihilo, and in reverse. And just like we cannot understand that God creates the world ex nihilo, nothing into something, because everything that our experience tells us is that there was something before, and now we are able to change the shape and form of that object. But we don't have the ability to create nothing into something. The same is true. We don't understand how God can give us this infinite light, and yet we feel independent. We're going to stop over here. We're going to tell a story to show these miracles of tzaddikim. And next week, we're going to continue chapter 5 and try to elaborate on it, because there's a lot to talk about over here. There's a very, very deep chapter, a lot of secret mystical ideas that are developed in this chapter. It's too long and too much for just one class. So we're going to end with a beautiful story which shows God's kindness and God's mercy, even in Golus, even in this exile. It's an individual story that happened to a couple who were married for 10 years. And this couple was married for 10 years, and they had no children. And the story is that there was a fellow, a Yid, traveling on an El Al plane, and next to him he sees a man with 2 kids, and 2 Jews sitting next to each other on a plane for 10 hours. He can't keep quiet. They start talking. And he says to the other, so what are you doing? Where are you traveling? I'm going to a simcha, going to a bar mitzvah, a wedding. Why are you traveling with your 2 sons to New York? He says, let me tell you a story. You see, I was married for 10 years. I had no children. And I went to my Rosh Yeshiva. I went to my rabbi. And I asked him what to do. I'm married for 10 years. He said, look, there are opinions that say that if you're married for 10 years and you have no children, you should divorce. You should divorce and maybe marry again, and you'll have better luck next time. Especially, said the Rosh Yeshiva, based on what you're telling me, that it seems that the shalom bayis, the peace in the house, is not great. And it happens very often that when there are no kids, so there's a lot of stress in the home, a lot of anxiety. When you have a child, there's a problem. You blame it on the kid. It's his fault. But now you have no one to blame it on. So it becomes a very, very high tension environment. So his Rosh Hashiva says, besides the fact that from what you're telling me, it seems like you're not getting along that well anyway, maybe you should divorce. The man says, look, it's very difficult for me to tell this to my wife. He says, don't worry, my wife can tell it to your wife. I deal with the men and my wife deals with the women. We'll break it to her slowly. He says, look, don't say anything yet. Let me find the right time to talk about it. He goes home that night and he goes to sleep. And after he's sleeping for about an hour, his wife wakes him up. Get up, get up. Why? What happened? What happened? She says like this, I just had a dream. The Lubavitcher Rebbe came to me and he said to me, you should know that in the year Tavshin Mem Tes, which was 1988, 1989 on the secular calendar, and that year your husband was involved with his yeshiva in Panovich, and they made many accusations against me and my chassidim. And because of this, it could be a reason why you have no children. And you should go to your Rav, your husband's Rav, and ask him what to do. She wakes him up and tells him the story. You know, we're not followers of Chabad. And all of a sudden, the Rebbe appears to me like broad daylight, talking to me face to face, telling me that you are involved with a group of troublemakers who spread terrible lashon hara and rumors about Lubavitcher Rebbe and his chassidim. Is it true? He says, yeah, it's true. I was in yeshiva and I wasn't very involved. Yeah, it's true. And he says, maybe that's the reason why we have no children, and you should go and talk to your Rosh Hashiva about it. He says, look, that's what you woke me up for. Get out of here. I want to go back to sleep. Don't bother me. And he turns around, goes back to sleep. An hour later, he gets up, wakes up his wife. He says, get up, get up. What happened? I too had the same dream. The Rebbe came to me. It was face to face, like broad daylight. And he said to me, you should know that in Tavshin Mem Tes, you were in Panovich, and you wrote terrible things, and you spread terrible gossip and Moisi Shemra, falsehood about me and my chassidim. And you should know that before you actually get a divorce, you should go back to your Rosh Hashiva and discuss it with him. And maybe there's an alternative. So now they're both trembling. They're both scared. What does all this mean? And as soon as the sun rose, he got up and he made his way to the yeshiva and went to his rabbi to tell him the story. The rabbi hears the story. He says, look, the fact that the Rebbe came to your wife and then he came to you, seems very obvious that it's a real dream. So I would suggest, he said, that based on the code of Jewish law, when you insult someone or you embarrass someone, and similarly, if you spread false rumors about people and the person already is no longer here in this world, you cannot go back and ask for mechila. You cannot go back and say, I'm sorry. The only thing you could do is to go to the grave of that person. And as it says in the code of Jewish law, to take with you 10 people, a minion of people, and stand before that person and apologize and say, look, I said this and this, and I regret it. I'll never do it again. Please forgive me. The Rosh Hashiva then concludes by saying, by the way, I would like to suggest that you go to the tomb of the Rebbe in New York, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but don't take 10 chassidim to be with you when you discuss what you did, because they might really harm you badly after they hear what you did to their Rebbe. So you should take, non-chassidim. He says, yes, I get it. So I have a brother-in-law, he says, in New York, and I'll call him and he will bring for me 10 people. Okay. He departs from the Rosh Hashiva, and this fellow who spoke ill of the Rebbe now calls his brother-in-law and says, I'm going to be on the next flight to New York. Please meet me at the tomb of the Rebbe. And if you could send over 9 of your Kolel people to meet me there so I can ask Mechila. And so that's what he did. He went to New York. He went to the Rebbe's oil, to the Rebbe's tomb, And there was waiting another 9 people. And he stood before us crying for the terrible thing that he did. And he went home. He went back to Israel. A year later to the day, his wife was blessed with twins. And the man concludes, these 2 children sitting next to me are the Rebbe's children. These are the 2 children that were born to me from the Rebbe's bracha. Every year on their birthday, I take them back with me to New York, and I bring them to the Ohel, to the Rebbe's tomb. And I tell them, you should know, your tati, your daddy made a mistake. He spoke bad and ill against tzaddikim, holy, righteous people, angels of God. And because of that, I suffered. I suffered for 10 years. And therefore, I did tshuva, and God forgave me for my sin. And therefore, I was gifted you 2 boys. And so you should know never to speak against tzaddikim, never to speak against great Torah scholars and holy people. And in this sukkos, you will be blessed with children and grandchildren that grow in the way of Torah and mitzvahs. So this is the message from today, that God created the world out of gevura. He created the world with many challenges. He created the world with many struggles. He created the world that every day we get up, there are many curveballs that come our way. And we ask ourselves, God, how am I supposed to overcome this? We look into the Tanya, we are reminded when God created the world with severity, with gevura, he also administered the attribute of mercy into the world. And that is through the miracles of the Torah and through the miracles of tzaddikim. When we relate these stories, when we read about these stories, and we contemplate these stories, this gives us the strength. This gives us the tools. This gives us the know-how to be able to overcome all of these challenges and to be able to overcome this darkness, to be able to overcome all of these obstacles. So we hope and pray that in the schus of the Holy Tanya and the schus of all of these tzaddikim throughout the generations and all of these miracles that God performs, that we should see miracles in our lifetime. We should see miracles with our own very eyes, and the ultimate miracle, the coming of Mashiach from Heda B'Meinu Amen.